The AI for Good Global Summit, convened by ITU, recognizes the joint responsibility of governments, the private sector, United Nations agencies, academia, and others to ensure AI reaches its full potential while preventing and mitigating harms.
And it's a moment that calls for action. And today I'm calling on each of you to use this summit to help the world to better understand what kinds of regulations, what kinds of guardrails we need to put in place right now. So together, let's make it innovative, let's make it safe, and let's make it responsible for all. Thank you very much.
Welcome to AI for Good, the leading action-oriented, global and inclusive United Nations platform on AI. Organized by ITU, in partnership with 40 UN sister organizations, and co-convened with Switzerland. The goal of AI for Good is to identify practical applications of AI to advance the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and scale those solutions for global impact. In today's session, we're counting on you to use the live video wall feature to ask questions and post comments to help create an engaging discussion. We encourage you to stay until the end to chat, connect, ask questions, and network with our distinguished panelists and world-class AI experts in the neural network. It is now time to kick off the session and welcome our first speaker. The floor is yours.
So, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the next webinar on AI for Earth and Sustainability Science. This is the second round already of this webinar series, and I'm Joachim Denzler. I'm co-curating this series together with Markus Reichstein, Gustavo Campbell, and Maria Piles. We have in this seminar series the discussion about recent progress in AI-enabled modeling and understanding of the Earth system from local to global scale and AI science-based diagnosis, prediction, and remedy of environmental crisis. Interdisciplinary researchers from academia, industry, and UN and government agencies, as well as NGOs, will talk about tackling systematic real-world challenges with AI, including disaster risk reduction and preparedness. We have today the next round of our session, and I'm happy to welcome for today Professor Jürgen Gall from the Computer Vision Group at the University of Bonn. He is there since 2013. He is also spokesperson of a transdisciplinary research area, mathematics, modeling, and simulation of complex systems, and member of the Lammer Institute for Machine Learning and Artificial Intelligence. After his PhD in computer science from the Saarland University and the Max Planck Institute of Informatics, he was postdoc at the Computer Vision Laboratory ETH Zurich from 2009 until 2012, and then senior research scientist at Max Planck Institute for Intelligent Systems in Tübingen until 2013. He received several important grants, including a Minota Research Group, ERC Starting Grant, and ERC Consolidator Grant in 2022. And he is further spokesperson of the DFG Funded Research Unit Anticipating Human Behavior, NPI of the Cluster of Excellence, Phenerop Robotics and Phenotyping for Sustainable Crop Production. He is also, of course, a PC member and area chair of all the big computer vision and machine learning conferences. And I'm happy to have you here, Jürgen, for today, and I'm looking forward to your presentation. The floor is yours.
So thank you for the nice introduction. And let's directly start with the presentation. So today I will talk about using AI for sustainable agriculture and forecasting. We already have seen as one of the introduction are the actually sustainable development goals. And this talk is a little bit closer or most close to the goal number 2, which actually address hunger and sustainable agriculture. And this is actually very important, that sustainable agriculture and hunger are at the same time, because when we talk about sustainable agriculture and we think of using no fertilizer, using no pesticides, that was not the solution, because at the end, if you don't use any fertilizers, then the crop, the yield will drastically drop. And then at the end, we would have an increase of the prices. So this absolutely makes sense that actually we're looking for sustainable agriculture, but we still have to maintain the supply of food to actually give enough nutrients for the world population. And to make it a bit clear, sustainable agriculture has many kind of different aspects. So one of the focus here will be more on the environmental aspects, so like fertilization, water consumption, land use. But there's also some other aspects like the social aspect and economic aspects. So in this talk, I will actually mainly focus a little bit how can we actually use AI to actually reduce or get a better understanding, to have a better management, to use, for instance, like the use of pesticides, fungicides, or also like fertilizers. So this work is actually what we do is like in the content. So at the end, we have here at the University of Bonn, also together with collaboration partners from the University of Göttingen and also at the Jülich Research Center, we have so-called a cluster of excellence, and that's our FINROP, where we actually focus on development technology. Main focus is on AI to, on the one hand, understand phenotype lands, but also to have some kind of a management to actually make sustainable or agriculture more sustainable. And I will just give you a few examples of the work what we actually do within this cluster. So one of the examples where actually technology is already available, maybe not yet used at a large scale, but this is like where we already have some progress. So if you think about like weed control, so you see here on the left, it's like an autonomous robot which actually goes on the field. You can actually also use this on your farm, and this actually does kind of mechanic reading of the weeds. And on the other side, you have it also on the right. This is kind of like machines which you add to your tractor, and this actually does some kind of spot or smart spraying. So to little bit make it clear, if the machine is autonomous, like the robot on the left-hand side, or technically attached to like a manual-driven machine, this actually doesn't matter for us too much. More important is what kind of management these machines are actually doing, independent if they're autonomous or not. And that means in order to understand what the machine should do, they need to have an understanding of the crops, and need an understanding of the field, and what are the states of the different crops. So here I show you an example. So this is images of a benchmark, which is also publicly available. So we run a challenge where we actually provide image data. So here you see already some of the annotations where we want to distinguish, for instance, like plants, and the red color here that corresponds to different weeds. We also want to know, okay, what are the individual plants? For instance, we want to count how many plants we have, what is the distance between the seeded plants, and also another information is also like what is exactly the individual leaf instances. For instance, there are some indices like the area of the leaf. This also gives us information about the state of the plants and also about the health state of the plants, which we are also interested in. So this is one part where we need to understand where are the plants, what are the weeds, and then based on this information, machines can actually go over it and do weeding or do other kind of management decisions. So another example, what we also address in the cluster, and that's specifically the case when we look at diseases or like stress factors. So this is an example here. We actually, it's not with a machine, but we fly over the field with like a drone, like a UAV. And here we capture image. So this example is from sugar beet. And from this kind of the sugar beet, we actually want to a little bit analyze what are the different aspects of the plants. In part, what we look, if the plant or the leaves, are they infected by a fungus? Here we actually looked at the Cercospora fungus, which is actually very lethal for a sugar beet plants and have a big impact on the yield. So it's very essential also to look for methods where, for instance, I will look only at RGB images, because technically that's very cheap. So at the end, if you think about sustainable agriculture, we also have to look at certain kind of methods where we use AI, but we can maybe use cheaper sensors, because at the end, hopefully this actually accelerates the technology to be used on real farms. So if you now went over the fields, flying, for instance, with a drone or driving over it, this actually doesn't matter so much. Now what you see here on the left, the small images, we actually can now measure and quantize what is like the amount of affected plants by the fungus. And we see it actually some of the small areas, the red one here, we have a higher percentage of infected plants, and green means like they are still in a good shape. And this is actually very important because at the end, when we have this information, then we can either send machines or UAV, which actually go off the field and they do the spraying. And we actually did kind of also studies that at the end, this actually use massively the amount of fungicides what we need to spread over the field. It actually doesn't matter. In this example, we use a UAV, but you can also use any other machine. So this is actually not that important. But it's very important that you have some kind of monitoring, because it's very important to react very early before the fungus is actually spread over the entire field. Another example, what we're also looking at, is the question, oops, a bit too fast, is actually the question, how can we actually recognize if there's actually some kind of nutrient deficiency? Because at the end, what we want to do, we want to actually steer the amount of fertilizer which actually is sufficient. We need to fertilize the plants, but we should not fertilize them more than necessary. And I give here also just like 3 examples. So this is also examples from a data set which is publicly available. At the bottom, you always see like the paper. You can also contact me. There's the link is also available, and you can also use this data for your research if you want. And this is like 3 examples of a sugar beet plant. So it's actually taking different rainy days. You see it also at different days of the time. The conditions, the environment also change. And for non-expert, it's really hard to distinguish or identify if there any nutrient is missing for the plants. Actually, even for me as a non-expert, for me, it's really hard to tell if you look at the image on the most right, what kind of nutrient is actually missing. So this is a very hard task, but now we also ask AI to solve this kind of task and make this kind of the prediction. So now comes the question, how do we collect data? And this is actually non-trivial party in the agriculture domain. Because at the end, if you think about diseases, you cannot easily spread the diseases just around the world. You actually have to do it in very controlled environments, because you just want to not spread diseases to neighboring fields of other farms. So at the end, either you do it in a controlled environment, but at the end, the implication is you cannot actually collect a huge amount of data. You can collect data, but only at specific sites and experiments. And the same is also holds when we actually look at nutrient deficiencies. So this is like what I can do in a fully controlled experiment. Like in hydroponics, you put the plant. So here you see different genotypes. They are just in kind of a liquid in hydroponics. And each of here is a boxes, actually, they're filled with different kind of nutrients. And in some kind of the boxes, we also have some toxic elements. And we actually look at this kind of the image, and then we can actually observe how different kind of the nutrients affect the growth of the plant. And we can also take pictures on it. On the positive side, this actually gives us full control of the nutrients. The negative side is that's not what's happening in the field. Neither are the plants looking as you would actually take the images on the field, and also the nutrient uptake for hydroponics is very different if the plant is in the soil, because you also in the soil, you need to consider the root structure is very different, the interaction with the soil, with the microponics. So they are very different kind of factors, which also impact this uptake of the nutrients. So that means if you want to have systems which recognize nutrient deficiency, we have to collect data on the field. And this is not trivial, because technically, if you take just a standard location, there is no nutrient-free soil. So you have to go for some kind of location where you have a lack of nutrients. The good thing is there are some kind of location. So here's like an example of Diekopshof, but there are also other locations across Germany, Europe, and probably also around the world, where there have been long-term fertilizer experiments. So that means there are what you see here, this kind of the plots. Each of the plots has since 100 years a different kind of treatment. Like some got like liming, some actually got some nutrients, some get other kind of fertilizers, but some of the plots are not fertilized at all. And then at the end, these different plots, actually, we know where the plants are, because when we capture the field here from the drone, then we exactly know the location where the plant actually corresponds to one of the plants. And this is exactly how we can actually collect data in the field and then look how the plant actually looks like when it's actually growing on different kind of soil conditions where certain nutrients are actually missing. So the problem is a little bit, even if you collect the data, there's still like the question, how do you deal with rare cases? Because at the end, you might actually have, like, there's the most dominant genotypes, but there are also some other genotypes which are very important for the agriculture domain, but also like you want to have new genotypes which are more robust to climate change. So you might not have so much of the data, and the same holds for weeds, because technically you don't want to remove all the weeds, because not all the weeds are actually in competition with your crop. And if you have more weeds, this also increases the biodiversity. But this also gives us the question, how can we actually recognize rare cases? And I mean here, rare classes, rare semantic classes. So now I have a look to one of my problems. So this is semantic segmentation, what I've shown before. I've given an RGB image, and I want here, for instance, like recognize the crop and the weed. Also want to distinguish maybe like different types of crops and different types of weeds. So now the issue is like we might have just like a lack of data, that we have not enough images which are of a certain weed, of a certain genotype. So this imposes a big problem. So now comes the question, can we actually use AI to actually solve, at least to some extent, the problem of having rare cases? And in order to give you kind of an answer that yes, to some extent we can do it, I now look at the reverse process. And that means like I do not start from the image and then do a semantic segmentation of the image. I do it the other way around. Now what I'm starting, I have given a semantic map. So this actually defines a different color, what's actually visible in the image. So you see here some stairs, or here in the middle image, there's the horse, there's some mountains, you have the sky. And now from this data, we use now generative AI to generate images which look plausible based on my content. So it's like, if you look at the images in the middle, so you see it like they're still kind of looking like a horse style. We have different styles of the mountains. And in this way, I can actually generate images which all look a little bit different. So for instance, like it's more like in the evening, it's more like a cloudy day, or here's like also the grassland, the color also a bit changes, but they're all consistent with my semantic map. So in some sense, I go the other way around. If I would manually annotate the data, instead of taking an image and annotate them, I take an annotated image, take this annotation map of my image, and now I generate more images. So now let's have a closer look how it actually works. There are actually many works which actually generate images from a semantic map. And I want to just like explain one popular approach. It's called like SPADE. So what it actually does is like you start with like a small noise vector, you sample from it just Gaussian noise, and then you have a generator, and this generator generates you an image. Now this generator is now conditioned on a semantic map. And here see like here, this kind of the pink color that corresponds to a building. Since the generator has to know when I can actually generate a realistic looking image, to train that generator, it also has like a discriminator who plays against the generator, and it takes like either a real image plus a label map or a generated image plus a label map, and tries to distinguish if my image, which has been generated, is it real or is like generated. So in this way, you can actually train the generator. So this approach, however, has two problems. The first thing, the noise is very small compared to the image what we want to generate. And that means like I have an issue that I cannot generate high diversity, which means like for a semantic map, I want to actually generate different images that not all look the same. And on the other hand, here the discriminator just tells me, well, the image is correct or has been generated not. That's not enough information because I'm interested in the pixel level. So we actually took this kind of the model and addressed this kind of the issues as an approach what we call OASIS. So the first key change what we did is we add noise to my semantic map. So that technically is the noise. One of the big change has the same resolution in terms of pixels as the output image, what I want to generate in my semantic map. So this is actually very important. And now I have actually a much larger way of generating noise. And the second aspect is the discriminator. Now it doesn't make like a final decision between an image, just at the title image. Yes, it has been generated or is real. Instead, my discriminator here tries to predict for each pixel. It doesn't matter if it's like a generated image or real image. What is actually for each pixel? If it's like a real image, and if it's a real image, what is exactly the class label of the image? Which means, is it a building? Is it a sky? Is it vegetation? Or if it's just like a generated image. So in this way, the discriminator actually needs to distinguish, and the generator actually needs to generate images where first, the generated image has to be consistent with the label map, which we use here as an input, and it has to look realistic. So now we can actually look at some qualitative results in a few minutes. But first, I also want to give you some kind of insights, because at the end, if you train the model, you usually have to do some kind of small tricks. And I give you just like a hint of one example, and that's what we call label mix regularization, what we introduced. So what you see here, again, that's the label map. So this is my input, and from this input, I want to generate an image which look realistic and is actually consistent with my label map. So this is like my semantic map, what I have as an input. That would correspond to my real image, which I actually have in my training data. And now this is an image which my current network actually generates. So this is like how I call the fake image. So now what I do to have some more consistency and get better results, I generate a mask M. And the way how I do it, I look at my input label map. I randomly sample some semantic classes. So you see it here, red is here the road. Here this color is like the pedestrian walk. And now at the end, if I randomly sample the classes, here for instance, like black means like, that means like I take the pixels from the generated image. And if it's like white in my mask, I take the pixel of my real image. And the combined image that you see here as label mix. So you see it, the street is from the real image, and the pedestrian walk, this is exactly from the generated image. So I mix a real and a generated image. And that's like, I feed this image also to my discriminator, which also tries to predict which of my pixels are from a real image, which of my pixels are from a generated image, and if it's from a real image, what is the semantic classes? But in order to recognize, I need to give this image a second image where I want that they are consistent. And this I actually do the other way around. So I have my real image, feed it through my discriminator, which is here denoted by dx. I also have my generated image, feed it through my discriminator, which is here denoted by dx head. And now I can also mix the output prediction of my discriminator for my real and my generated image, also again using my mask, and combine them. So in this way, I can actually try now ask my network that this image's prediction should be the same. So if I first make the prediction of the two images by the discriminator, and then I mix the prediction of the classes, or if I mix the two images before and then send it through my discriminator. And this actually improves the quality of the images. So this just like in kind of the metrics. So just to give a little rough idea, so FID is a metric to measure the quality of the generated images. And we see actually lower is a better number, which actually means if you don't use any regularizer, then at the end we get right 50, and at the end, if we add the regularizer, the accuracy goes down. And the second metric here, that's like this semantic consistency. So what we actually do, if we generate the image, we feed it to a network for semantic segmentation, and then we measure how good is the output of the semantic segmentation of the generated image with respect to my original input mask. And it means the higher this number is, the more consistent is my image with respect to my semantic map. And we also see that this regularizer also nicely improves the semantic consistency of the generated image. So now let's have a look, which is a bit more interesting, at some of the results. So here you see two examples. So the first is like here you have like a street scene, you have like a label map, you have different parts here of the buildings. And now at the end, because what I mentioned, our approach does not generate a single image. Because at the end we have the noise, we sample from the noise, and for each sampled noise, we generate different types of the image. And I show here just like 5 examples, but you can generate as many images actually you want to generate. And you see it actually like all the kind of the image has a slightly different style, so the style of the buildings is also different. And the same is also when we have an image here from like inside of a building. So also what we see that the room layout actually changes. So it's like the deco of the rooms change, and also the bed actually changes. So this is like one way where we generate multiple samples from a single semantic map. But this is like, remember, our noise is we have as many noise values as we have pixels. But another nice property of this approach is now we can decide we do not want to change everything in the image, because remember, actually we were interested to somehow to improve or generate more variation of the rare cases. We are maybe not that interested to change, for instance, like the room layout, and that you can still do. So instead of varying the noise for an entire image, so what you actually do, you only vary the noise for here the semantic class of the bed of this region. And what you can actually see, all the images, the room layout in the second row is identical. It does not change, but what is actually changing is the bed. So we have different styles of the bed. And obviously, if you're looking for a Christmas card already, you can also generate different patterns like making a heart or like a circle. Feel free to use it. Source code is available, and with some kind of little expertise, you should easily be able to easily try it out. So there are more things what we can do. I give you a little bit more examples, which is a little bit more an outdoor scenes. So again, this was my label map, which I have as an input. And now what I generate here, again, a sample noise for my entire image. That means like each image we have changes, the sky is changing, the kind of the style of the vegetation is also a little bit changing. And here at the bottom, here show like 2 examples where we change only part of the image. So in this case, I only change the sky. So you see it like the vegetation in all the 3 images remains the same, only the sky here actually changes. And on the other examples here, I only change the vegetation, and we get also different variants. And you can do it for outdoor images, and you can also do it for indoor images. So here another example, also indoor images. Here we change the noise for the entire image, and we also get different variants of the same image. In the 2 examples at the bottom, here, so it's like maybe hard to see, but here the window has also like a different color, but you can also simply mark in the image which part you want to annotate. If you have the semantic map, you simply click on the window, and it actually changes the window. So where you're looking out, if you want to have curtains and so on. Or if you want to prefer to change this kind of the chair, it also changes the color of the chair. So this actually works very nicely. So, but what if you do not have time to annotate, or you have an image which you have not annotated yet? This is also not a big problem, as long if you have already a method or a network which actually does the semantic segmentation. So now what we have an input image, and I now want to recreate a different image which has the same layout, but it looks in a different style. And that we can actually straightforward do. The first step what we do, we take the input image, and then we do semantic segmentation. That means like here we use a pre-trained network, which was trained to segment the semantic class in the image. So here again, red is bed, purple is like the floor, gray is here like the sky. And now from this semantic map, this is actually we fit in our oasis, in our approach. And now we can actually generate different images which have the same semantic style as our original image, but we now have different appearance. Also like here, the houses actually look different. Also here with the mountains, also the rocks. So here we have a snowy part, here different kind of the types of the mountains and also the environment. So this actually means we can actually generate variants of an image. So this sounds nice. It's nice to play with it, but let's come a little back to our original question. Does it actually help us? remember, we want to use it for in our agriculture domain, or we want it used in cases where we have some classes which occur very rarely. And that actually we investigate is like if we can discover the network which generates variation of an image for a single semantic map, can we also use this in a way that we can actually improve approaches which actually understand the images? To a little bit analyze it, so we used going back to like a semantic segmentation task. So this is an example from the agriculture domain, but the example where we did the analysis is actually from a different domain, but it can also hold here for the agriculture domain. So to actually make the analysis, so we use the other data set. So this is actually, by the way, a bridge here at Bonn. And technically, this is kind of the annotations. What they have is a data set where people annotated here, where are the streets, blue are the color of the cars. This bright color is like the sky. And if you look closely at the image, what you recognize probably very easily, some classes, they occupy most part of the image. They are everywhere, like streets, sky, that's all the time. You still have also a lot of pedestrians, but if you look at bicycles already, then they occur not as often. And now one of the questions always what we can actually look at, how does actually the frequency, how often a class occurs in my image, how does it actually affect the recognition accuracy? You analyze this aspect, we use this type of a data set, and now what we did, we sorted the classes depending how often they occur. And that we measured how many pixels in my training data have been annotated, for instance, by the class 1, which would be street, car 2 would be kind of sky, class 3 would be in this ranking probably in cars and also trucks. And if you look in this example, the top 5 classes, they actually make nearly over 80% of all the pixels in our semantic information. And as expected, that's the easy cases because we have a lot of training data. Now let's look at the classes which actually occur less often. So if we go to the next type of set of classes, they cover 20%, and we see already here the accuracy drops from 90 to 66%. And this is actually very common. You have to be in mind, if you use AI, you always have to deal with the cases that some classes are very rare, and that's like you have to be very careful how to deal with these kinds of classes. And if you go even more extreme, looking at the classes which occur only like less than a few percentages, so for instance, like the last 5 classes in our ranked in our sorted ranking, they cover less than 2% of the pixels in my training data. And accordingly, my accuracy of my off-the-shelf semantic segmentation approach is only 50. So now comes the question, what will happen if I take the same data, I use this data to train my generative AI to generate more variation for the same annotated image? In other words, I take an image in my training data which has been annotated. I take the semantic map of this kind of my training image, and then I generate more images for the same semantic map. And we use this as additional training data for training our approach for semantic segmentation. So if I now feed it in, now what we see is like, well, there is some kind of improvement, but now the more interesting is I get a little improvement for the classes, which I anyway can already recognize very good. But more important is like I get more improvement the more rare my classes are. And this is actually very nice because it's like generative AI is not for playing around. You can also use it partly to deal with issues when you have rare classes in your dataset. So now this is the example. It only works when you have to start with a data set where you have enough data. So let's say we have images which have been annotated, for instance, on the field, but they have shown the examples before, like weeds or different genotypes or leaves. But that tech means you have a lot of data, but some of the classes are underrepresented. Then we can use the approach what I've mentioned before. But what can you do if you have only very few samples? Remember, if you want to deal with some kind of diseases, part of like very really risky diseases, then you cannot collect much data because you cannot spread the diseases. You can collect only very few data samples. And the same is also for nutrient deficiency, where you cannot collect millions or billions of data because you need to actually get some control environments where you can somehow, to some extent, have a control of the nutrients. So now comes up the question, can I use also at this point generative AI? And let's have a look what we can actually do. So the first thing, what is our problem? So let's say we have already trained a generative network on a large data set. So GS means like that's my source generative network. Here I trained on a lot of images of churches. So this is thousands of images. But I'm not interested in churches at all. So I'm interested in something different, might be from agriculture. Here we simply picked shells, like a different domain. And we have only 10 examples of images of different species, of different types of shells. We do not have more samples. Now comes the question, can we actually train a network on only 10 images? Because remember, most generative networks use a huge amount of images. But here comes the question, can we also train them if we have very few examples, in this case, only 10? And I will a bit show, yes, we can actually do it, but not in a naive way. So if we just would take these images, we would either train the generative network from scratch, or just show a little bit later, if we just would have the network pre-trained, we take our 10 images and we continue the training for a few iterations, we would not get good results. So this is an example where we actually train our generative network only on 10 examples, and you see it does not nature generates realistic looking images, nor does it have any diversity, because it always generates small variation of this weird looking image. Therefore, we have to do something different. And now what we actually do when we make the change, which I will explain, now in this case, we actually get quite nice images. I mean, it's still argue if that's kind of a shell, but technically think about it, we have only 10 variations, and we want now to a little bit see how can we actually do different variations from the shells. And the important thing is we do not want to reproduce the training data, because then we would not generate anything new. So for instance, if you look at the shell here on the most right, so it's kind of a composition of, on the one hand, some part of this color, and also maybe some part of this kind of the shape. So the network should also combine the information and also create a new shapes. So it will not distinguish if you consider this as a shell or not. So how can we actually do it? If we just train it, it will not work. So we have to do something different. And remember, we can use existing generative networks which have been trained on very large data sets, but we are not interested on the types of images which it was used for training, because we were looking at a very different domain. There's one very nice property of generative networks, because at the end, if we train the network, and we have, remember, we sample images by actually adding noise or a variation in my so-called latent space. If I make small changes in a certain direction, I get usually smooth transitions between the images. And that means, like in this example, if I add some noise, I do not get purely different images. If I add a small epsilon here, I get small changes. In this case, well, I get like a zooming in or like different styles of the churches, but it completely does not change to a very different image. And the smoothness property, this actually has been explored and understood in actually many works, which is a very nice and interesting property of generative models. So now what we actually want to do, we want to have a similar property if we train our network, which is here the target network, denoted as GT, on an example with very few examples. So for instance, like the shells. And the shells is not any image related which was used to train my source generator. If you would train this kind of network on a few samples, I would not have this nice property. I would not have smooth transition. I would have like really weird jumps, getting weird results, or it would just stay the image and does not change it much, as we have seen before. So what I actually want to do to transfer just the smoothness property of my source generator to my target generator, what we actually propose to add a regularizer, which actually means we look at the gradient. So it's not a gradient of the network, but a gradient in our latent space, which has been learned by the network. And we want that this property is actually preserved. So we actually like minimize the difference between the gradients. You can think about the Hessians if you're a little bit more familiar with the topic. So now let's have a look what results we actually get. So the first results what we actually get is when we technically have the part technically here, when we have a set of the kind of the images, is kind of a part of the images from kind of the monkey example, only 10 examples. And now technically what we actually do, we actually generate a set of kind of the images. So this at the bottom, so this were the face images which were originally used for training the model. And this is kind of the image which are actually a bit generated by our kind of the model. And if you would just take at the top row, this is like by other approaches, if you would just like continue the training, in this case, here you see the images are just reproduced. They do not generate any variation. That is not very helpful. And also for the other cases, so here we generate image which actually not looking unrealistic. So we can also look at another examples. If you look at the shells, also here, if you look at this kind of examples, again, we actually have trained, the pre-trained is on churches, and now we adapt the model to shells. Also here, what we actually do is like what we get, this kind of the shells which are generated by our model, while actually here, in this case, if we just do this kind of a continuum of training, we just repeat the training examples. So this is also another example. If your network has been pre-trained on many different classes, so this like the typically interpolation what you get in a generative model. So what you do, you move in your latent space and it actually generates images of different classes. So here's like you change from kind of a dog, then it goes to wolf, and then even going to buses. So if you just continue training and we train on images of flowers, we don't get anything reasonable out of it. So it's also here, also kind of super noisy part here of the image. It's not looking at the flower at all. If we use our approach, we actually get some kind of nice interpolation and we get also variation of the flowers. So let's coming back to our original problem where we want to actually detect new trends from the images. So actually, this is actually like a question, how we can actually use this kind of the part when we have only very few examples. So we use the method what I have just described. We use a generative model which has been trained on a very large data set. And this kind of the model, we actually then train this on a very small data set. To be a little bit more precise, we picked 10 samples here of sugar beet, where we actually have some healthy plants, and the other kind of the part here, we have plants which actually suffer from nitrogen deficiency. So we have only 10 samples for each of the two classes. So now what we do, we train our generative model on the 10 images of the healthy plants, and now it also generates images, and we do the same for the images where we have the plants with nitrogen deficiency, and that's the image which are generated. So now comes the question, are any kind of information still encoded information, which is related to the nutrients? So to test this kind of the hypothesis, what we actually did, we take the generated samples we used before a network which actually classified, trained on real images, and tried to make a binary decision. Is my plant healthy, or is there actually kind of a nutrient deficiency? So technically, one of the cases technically here, we have this kind of the 10 images. That's the generated image. We actually apply the network which has been trained on real images. And here it's also like in over 99% of the cases, the images are actually corrected, classified to be healthy plants. And in the set where we have actually generated images, all there around 95% of the image also are correctly classified that there is a nitrogen deficiency. And this is somehow a little bit amazing because technically the network, we simply ask, generate image, given only 10 images that look the same. And this is actually surprising because the network has no semantic information. There was no class information given to the network if there was some kind of a deficiency or not. But it still generates images where some of the features which also used for the network for classification is actually still included, which is, I think, very interesting. So now I'm coming to the last part. So see, I'm slightly over time, where I want to talk about the second part regarding forecasting. And I just want to give 2 examples. One is actually forecasting wildfires. We've seen this year all the time, this like a big issue. And what we actually did is also like we used AI to make the forecasting for the next day. So what we actually do, what we feed in, some meteorological data, some satellite data, and also some kind of land cover. And what we actually did is like we predict, so this is only for Greece, for the next day, like kind of a heat map, where's the probability? Red means a high probability that there might a wildfire actually ignite. And we also looked up for measuring how good the approach is. And actually on the next day, the black circle here, that was actually the point where actually really a wildfire actually started. So now we actually have to consider the case that we have different variables, because we have on the one hand static variables like elevation, also what is important was the distance to the next water like lake, rivers, and we also have dynamic variables like NDVI, which is related to vegetation index, temperature during the day, night, humidity, and also wind speed. And that if you feed it in, it's actually very important to treat static and dynamic variables in a different way. So this, we actually see it in the network architecture. So here we feed in the dynamic variables. So they're over time. So we use 3D convolution to also have the temperature information. So you see here, T is the time axis. And here at the bottom, here we feed the static variables like land cover, elevation, and so on. And then we only have 2D convolution because here there are different kind of variables, but there's no time axis. So this, on the one hand, this actually helps because we save resources. We do not need to have the full resources and just like copy the static variables. But this is not perfect, because think about temperature. Temperature has a different meaning for wildfire or like a drought, depending on the height. So the certain temperature at the mountain might be different what they have actually close to the in the valley. Or the humidity at the river is also different compared to more in a region where no water is actually close by. And this actually you also want to model. And that's actually what we actually did is like, so here you have features or like the dynamic variables. So just like ignore the notation here. So this set here, that's my dynamic variables. And now what I want to do, like I want to normalize my temperature, for instance, like on the elevation or the height. And that's what I'm doing it also here. I multiply by a scaling factor and also add a constant vector for it. So I normalize the values. So now I'm skipping a little kind of the details from the part. So technically, now what it actually means, we actually condition my dynamic variables on my static variables. And this actually gives me a normalization, but this normalization is learned by the network itself. It's not like a predefined normalization factor what we do by ourselves. So using this kind of a network structure, we show also in the paper that this actually gives them much better results, but I want to show some quantitative results. So what we actually have here, like examples where prediction is always for the next day. Black circles meet where we have actually was in the record there was like a wildfire, and here the red parts, that's like where we had the prediction that the wildfire started. In August, here we also had more, and it's also important that we have actually these black circles that you also predict them, but you don't want to have a prediction everywhere, because this kind of the maps can be, for instance, used to actually organize resources, for instance, for fire brigades, or actually where to put the people which actually fight against the wildfires to allocate resources. So this is another example where we have it on on example on a day we have just a little wildfire, but even there actually started, but it's very localized. And then just 1 month later, here we had large regions where our model predicts that a wildfire starts. So I'm already quite at the end of my talk. So for the last part, I just want to a little bit summarize the last aspect, and that also like forecasting agriculture droughts. And I just want to give you the high-level ideas. If you make longer forecasting, then that becomes more hard for AI. So what we actually do, we combine simulation models on one hand for doing long-term predictions, and we also combine AI together. So let's say we have a simulation model which generates, for instance, like prediction for the current and also in the future, which called projection. What is the change of certain variables? Making prediction. Here's the focus here related to the water cycle. And now what we can also do, because the simulation usually they do not contain all variables. For instance, the simulation model does not contain agriculture drought. So now what we do, we use the simulation data to actually make a prediction for a vegetation health index. And the same is also what we actually do in the future. When we have a simulation, we can also make the prediction for other variables. And here the simulation, here we talk about when we do a simulation for many years in the future. And now at the end, we instead of trying to model everything, we can also use AI to predict from a simulation model other variables. In this case, is some index which are related to agriculture drought. So I will now skip a few parts, and I want to show you some kind of some of the results. So this is kind of the model. So what we actually do, we take our model, then we have a network, and then we predict the NDVI in the brightest temperature. So NDVI is a vegetation index, and the brightest temperature is kind of a temperature-related stress index. And from this indices, what the networks predict from the simulation data, then we can compute a vegetation health index. And I will now directly skip to the final video and jump a few slides because I'm a little bit over time. So this is the final video what I want to show. So here you see the prediction of the model here of the vegetation index and the brightest temperature. And then from this, both of the index values, here we can then actually then compute the vegetation health index. So at the end, remember, we do a simulation many years ahead. So this is actually for several years ahead in the future. And then at the end, we map this kind of the prediction to predict the vegetation health index. And we can also compare. So on the left, that you see some observation at a certain year, which is actually the vegetation health index, what we get from remote sensing data. And on the right hand here, we actually see data which actually predicted from combination of first doing simulation and then also doing our AI to make the prediction of the vegetation health index. We do not expect that at the end, the prediction at each pixel at a time is the same, because you cannot predict where exactly at what time you have a expected agriculture drought. But we can actually look at it and actually compare where we actually have some pattern, where we have an increase, but it's actually very nicely localized at which region we actually expect an increase of certain agriculture droughts, where they actually are. And still remember, they're still connected with the simulation model. We still can actually look what kind of the variables in my simulation model had actually impacted this kind of the droughts. And we can then also look it up, not only at the remote sensing data. So this is just like the last part, video is nearly at the end. We can then also look at the records. So here's like data from 2018. And then we can actually look where certain drought events actually have been barred at the source data, or they have been kind of heat waves, and they are actually very consistent what we actually have generated. So this brings me to the end of my presentation, and I think I'm over time, so I'm gonna have to a little bit look. And now I think we have time for some questions. So thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jürgen, for this impressive presentation, especially the first part where you showed what needs to be done to arrive at the training data that you want to have in agriculture. So we have not so much time left, 7 minutes for questions, and I pick out some that I already see here. I think the first one that relates to what you did with the data augmentation is by Jacob Bruin. He is asking, there has been a previous talk discussed imbalanced data set of rare species photographed by camera traps. Could your technique help there?
In principle, yes. I think it's the kind of the part is also the same example. So technically, every time when we have kind of rare cases, we can also generate them. So I think it would also a little bit help. You have to a little bit consider like the two cases. In the first case, when we just have like a few variation, because if you have a trap, usually you have a small sequence of an animal in a short video sequence, depending what they store, a single image or like a set of images. But you could also use this as a training data to also generate the images. And in some cases, what you can also do, you can also in some cases to double check if some of the images look unrealistic, you can also automatically discard some of the images which do not fit. But in principle, this is somewhat a little bit agnostic. So it's not specific to a certain domain. I think it would also work there.
I hope that this answered the question. I see no comment. And then the second one, which is of course a reasonable one in all the areas where you apply AI with big deep learning models. The question is by Michelle Speiser about the aspect of sustainability. How energy intensive are the machine learning models discussed for usage in agriculture?
Yeah, so this is really lightweight because technically the thing is that technically they are not very expensive. So I think we also reported in the papers. So at the end, this is the models what they can easily train. You don't need a GPU cluster for it. This is kind of the models what they can actually train in a few hours on the data. So this is also the reason why it actually was the focus on having kind of also the case where we have limited data. Then it's like the models are actually not that big. And the other thing, the sustainable aspect is also very important. That's, for instance, like for the forecasting, where we also distinguish between dynamic and static features, because at the end, if we reduce also in this way the resources. So at the end, all the kind of the models, what I've shown here, they actually are straightforward to actually train. They do not take so much resources. More expensive would actually the pre-trained large model, for instance, like when we did the adaptation of like a pre-trained generative model, which probably has been trained on millions of images. This model will be expensive, but here we do not train this kind of from scratch. We use it as a given model, which are publicly available, and use it then do the adaptation to our images from the agricultural domain. And this is actually, it does not take much time. The pre-training of a large model, that's expensive, but the adaptation, what I've shown here, with just like a few short examples in the agriculture domain, that is like we talk about of a range of a few hours, with just like a single GPU. So that's not expensive.
Okay, the next question by Siam El Garoussi. How do you incorporate the fuel component in your fire model? The fuel component.
So I'm not sure what it exactly mean. Maybe
there's no further specification whether it's really fuel that is somewhere around that can be.
Yeah, so I'm not sure. I mean, here we talk about wildfire. So the only input what we actually do is we take as an input. So we have like information like regarding the elevation, like what from geographic information. We have information about the land cover, and the other information what we use is like meteorological data, like the temperature of the last days, if there are humidity, this kind of part. That's the only input what we actually take.
Yeah, I think that should clarify the question. And so then the next one by Ahmed Duce. Can we detect forest droughts by enhanced machine learning by use of optimization techniques like PSO?
So the reasons like, so PSO in the part is technically with particle swarm optimization. So this is kind of the part you don't need it technically. So when you have this kind of the models, when you do the prediction, you train it there, but you don't need to have an additional optimization process. And this also has a big advantage because it takes maybe some time to train the model, but the inference is very fast. Also, if for instance, like if you think you would optimize it with PSO, it takes many kind of iterations, but as in when we train it, we just train it with standard backpropagation. I'm not sure if that answered the question.
Yeah, let's see. So we, by the way, we have more time than the remaining 2 minutes that I mentioned before, so we can go over time if there are more questions. There's by Michelle another specification or more concrete clarification of the question. I meant for inference rather than training, the energy consumption.
I see. Yeah, so I'm not that sure. I mean, technically what you want and optimize for it, right? I mean, you have then the model which actually makes this kind of the prediction of this kind of the maps. And I'm not really sure how you actually can then use the further optimization, what you actually want to optimize. I think this, when you want to actually get improvement, I would actually rather go to the kind of the model and actually modify the model, or see that actually like the way how I train the model. So to get a benefit, I would in this case rather go to the model, maybe to look at different kind of resolutions. But I don't really see a big benefit to use for the inference some additional optimization technique like particle swarm optimization. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Okay, so at the moment there's no further from the audience, but I have at least one that I'm not sure about what is done. So you have these normalization variables that are learned. So
yeah.
Are there any ways to interpret them by probably even experts from the domain?
Yeah, so this is actually not that trivial, because one of the issues, like when we add this module, it's not anymore the original variables, right? Because we already have convolutions over it, and technically, so they already get a little bit kind of combined. So we actually looked a little bit how it actually affects, because at the end, if you would just have the example with elevation temperature, then you would clearly show if it actually fits. But one has to be a little bit careful, because there are already some kind of convolution operation on top of it. So we looked for it, but here we did not clearly get a clear picture for what actually this kind of the variables, what's connected, because technically the input variables are not anymore the original static variables, because they already have a little bit modified by some convolutions before. This makes it a little bit more difficult, the interpretation.
I see. Yeah, and then a question related to the generated images from the plants. Do you have let farmers check what they would say for these plants, whether they are nutrient deficient or not?
Yeah, so this, so the first thing, if I look a little bit closer at the image, so usually they look at certain symptoms, right? And if you look at the images, so the network also generates some patterns at the moment, which would just distract the expert, because there's some small patterns in it, like stripes, small stripe patterns, what you would not look at the expert this kind of the part. So we also showed this kind of the image to actually experts, partly from people from actually plant science, which actually know what kind of symptoms you actually expect. And they were actually a little bit distracted by the small patterns, which are actually a little bit there. In some cases, it generates some kind of the symptoms, but also sometimes patterns are a little bit generated, which you would not expect as an expert if you look at a picture of an image. So this is still kind of something which you would like to improve, to also get rid of certain kind of artifacts, what the generative model still generates, what it would not have in the real image. For the classification network, it did not matter so much, because also there they subtract or they abstract the information. They'll also look at certain frequency, and they are also partly known to actually discard some high frequency information. But as in human, you are a little bit more sensible to some high frequency information, and that was a bit distracted. But the thing is, like, if you discuss it with kind of experts, then you see that the generated image for the plants, if you have only 10 images, then you have some artifacts. But obviously, if you would have more images, then the images would also look more realistic.
Okay, thank you. So I don't see any further questions at the moment. Probably we'll wait for some that might. There's a question by Siam El Farouzi again. He's interested in understanding what variables are used to represent the state of the vegetation.
Right, from the this was probably referring to the last part where we predict the vegetation health index, I assume. So at the end here we used both. We used as an input, we used first information about the environment, land cover, and so on, and this TSMP model, what we actually use for the simulation, this actually covers a different kind of information with a focus on everything related to water flow. So it also includes the simulation model of under groundwater flow, also humidities at different kind of levels of the atmospheres, and also to some extent also some relation with kind of the clouds that were actually kind of the input. And then technically from this, when we predict the brightness temperature in the NDVI, from this then technically we use then the standard way how then actually compute first the thermal condition index and the vegetation condition index, and then from this we actually then compute the vegetation health index. What is probably also a little bit interesting that if we train the network to predict the vegetation health index directly, it performed worse. It was actually better to predict NDVI and also brightness temperature, and then from this compute the drought index instead of predicting the drought index directly. That was also a bit surprising, but it also has to be to do with some memorization, what are actually done for the indices.
Okay, so there's a question about the slides, but this presentation is online available, so you can just see this presentation again and again, so you don't need the slides probably. And there is also no further question at the moment. I feel that we had now around 15 minutes of question, which is the normal amount of time that we spend in QA. So Jürgen, again, thanks a lot for this very nice presentation with a lot of insights. I have more questions related to the computer vision part, but I think that can be done later on. And also, of course, thanks to the audience that is still here with around 80 people. And please try to be connected with Jürgen for the next couple of minutes in the network session that comes after this here. Thanks to all of you. And I'm closing this session. Thank you. Bye-bye.
See you later.
Thank you for participating in today's AI for Good session. We hope you've learned something new, innovative, and engaging in today's event. We now encourage you to continue the conversation on the live video wall in the neural network. Here you can ask questions, like and comment, share links, complete the poll, connect with interesting profiles, or speak one-on-one using the chat and video function. We invite you to explore the lobby, try the smart matching quiz, visit the virtual exhibits, poster boards, the eShop, and build your personalized AI for Good program. Let's shape the future of AI for Good.
The AI for Good Global Summit, convened by ITU, recognizes the joint responsibility of governments, the private sector, United Nations agencies, academia, and others to ensure AI reaches its full potential while preventing and mitigating harms.
And it's a moment that calls for action. And today I'm calling on each of you to use this summit to help the world to better understand what kinds of regulations, what kinds of guardrails we need to put in place right now. So together, let's make it innovative, let's make it safe, and let's make it responsible for all. Thank you very much.
you